That's all good.
Great, yep.
Cool. So yeah, as Graham said, tonight I'm going to be talking to you about my PhD research, which I actually have just recently submitted before Christmas.
Well done.
Thank you. Good Christmas present. So yeah, the bulk of this talk is this PhD, and as Graham said, the title is Core Surprise, What's Inside a Plate Boundary Fault? So as Graham also mentioned, this research is published in the Geoscientist magazine, and it's also a journal article in the Geological Society of London last year, and it's also been accepted pending edits for an article in Earth and Planetary Science Letters, so that will hopefully be published in due course this year at some point. So major earthquakes can occur on any large fault, but 90% of earthquakes are associated with plate boundary faults. Therefore, understanding the internal structure, for example, what the fault core is composed of, how thick it is, and the geometry of the fault is crucial, because their fault structure and properties control how and where earthquakes rupture, nucleate, and propagate. So this in turn limits the size of the earthquake or the amount of energy that can be radiated to the surface in seismic waves, and consequently impacts surface severity and damage. So for example, the 1999 magnitude 7.7 earthquake along the Chulungpu Plate Boundary Fault, which was the second deadliest earthquake in Taiwan's recorded history, saw significant variations in slip and ground motions at different locations along these faults, which is shown in these images. So as you can see here, the damage range from burst dams to collapsed buildings, to bent running tracks and fallen temples. In the northern end of the plate boundary fault saw the highest displacement and slip rates, and consequently the greatest surface damage, whereas the southern end of the fault saw smaller displacement and minimal damage. So subsequent field investigations related these changes to variations in the fault structure. So for example, the width of the fault core and the geometry of the juxtaposed beds on either side of the fault. So this in turn controlled how the fault moved and therefore the damage. So in summary, understanding the internal structure of plate boundary faults is crucial if we are to better understand and mitigate damage from future natural disasters. So just for those who are not aware, I guess, of faults in a more detailed sense, they're not just a line on a map or a plane with an interpreted 3D seismic volume. They are a zone of variable deformed rock. Studies of the internal structure of a fault show that variable deformed fault rock consequently leads to variable mechanical and hydraulic properties that control how the fault moves with regards to earthquake. So typically we view the fault as a 3-component model. So So you've got the host rock, which is the type of rock being faulted, the fault core, which accommodates most of the fault slip and the maximum displacement, and the bounding fracture-dominated damage zone around the fault core. So the fault core can range from centimetres up to metres wide, and contains fault rocks such as gouge, breccia and cataclysite. And the damage zone, which can reach several hundred metres wide, may comprise of fractured host rocks, subsidiary faults, veins and folding at all scales. Sorry, I'm just having trouble with my, there we go. So despite the fact that 90% of global seismicity occurs at plate boundary faults, our knowledge of their internal structure is lacking, as studies typically are biased towards smaller displacement faults that are much easier to study in the field. So for example, as you can, on this bottom figure here, compilations of data from multiple fault studies show that faults get wider on average as displacement increases. And this is thought to represent a growth trend where low displacement faults represent an early stage of fault growth, but as they evolve and become more mature and displacement increases, to get more complex internal structures, where this is shown on these figures, figure A and B above. So in A, the fault is down here, it's in the early stages of, it's low displacement, early stages of growth, and then as it evolves, it becomes a lot more complex in the internal structure. But in these data sets, the compilations, plate boundary faults have largely been excluded. So recently there's been a lot of interest in drilling along plate boundary, down into plate boundary faults to see how the internal structure of active plate boundary fault zones influences slip behaviour. So findings from these projects have highlighted the presence and importance of clay-rich fault rocks. So for example, this slide shows the San Andreas borehole that was drilled through the San Andreas plate boundary fault. And drilling at this location revealed that the internal structure of the San Andreas fault consists of wall rock of contrasting lithology and of distinct terrain. So you've got quartz feldspathic wall rocks and the oceanic serpentinite on the other side, and the fault core consists of a gouge with wall rock class. The gouge is roughly 3 meters wide. But such projects are very expensive. The bill for the San Andreas project alone was $25 million. And they're also limited in what they can tell us. Essentially, it's just a 1D transect across a fault. You can't capture the internal variability. So this leads on to the Highland Boundary Fault. What about the example of a rare, well-exposed plate boundary in Scotland? So this is the picture of the Highland Boundary Fault running across Craigavon Bay, just north of Stonehaven. And comparable to the San Andreas, you've got distinct wall rocks on either side of the fault. So to the north, you've got quartz feldspathic metamorphic Dalradian, and to the south, you've got serpentinites of the Highland border ophiolite. So yeah, like I say, unlike the San Andreas, it's relatively well exposed. And it's been a fault that's been studied for geologists by over 100 years, but nobody has looked at the internal structure of it. So with permission from the Scottish Natural Heritage, we went to the beach and tried to dig it up with spades and attempted to move the very large boulders that were in the way. So just to, yeah, so first of all, before I did the digging, I suppose I should say, I remapped all the exposures and we dug at 6 different locations. So this is my remapped map of Stonehaven, and we dug at 6 different locations along the fault. Shown here is these log 1, log 2, log 3, log 4, log 5, log 6. And we did a cross-fault transects perpendicular to the fault plane to try and capture this internal fault variability. So just to give you a bit of context, as Graham said, it's such a well-known structure that many of you might already know this anyway. But for those who don't, the Highland Boundary Fault is a mature crustal fault with a very long and complex history. It extends for over 240 kilometres from Stonehaven in the northeast of Scotland down towards the Isle of Arran in the southwest, with possible along strike extensions into Ireland. To the north of the fault, shown in my map is the grey, we have the Dalradian, and south we have intermittent exposures of the Highland border ophiolite. So the Highland Boundary Fault is thought to have been active during 2 events of the Caledonian orogeny. So the early Ordovician Grampian orogeny, about 480 million years ago, and the Akkadian orogeny, about 420 million years ago. And like the San Andreas Fault, the Highland Boundary has grown and evolved through time Early fault motion during the Grampian aborigine was thought to be reverse motion, and then it was later reactivated in the sinistral strike slip during the Acadian. But like many other terrain-bounding crustal scale Caledonian faults in Scotland, it wouldn't be surprising if the fault accommodated minor motion more recently associated with late Acadian orogenic collapse or North Sea extension or the North Atlantic opening. So we observed lots of strike slip faults in the damage zone, suggesting we see evidence for these sinistral strike slip motion. And using the fault terminology that of just how people describe faults, you've got the Highland hanging wall damage zone to the north being the Dalradian, the footwall damage zone of the fault to the south being the Highland border ophiolite, and in the middle we've got this internal fault core. So I'll just talk to you a bit more about what we found the structure of the fault to be like. So this is just a picture looking southwest across Craigieven Bay, with Stonehaven town just being in this bay beyond the picture. So after digging and exposing the fault at several different localities, we revealed a remarkable sequence through this ancient plate boundary, shown in this log here. And at all localities, we found that the fault consists of a single fault core strand bound by damage zones of contrast and lithology. So like I said, to the south, you've got the Highland border ophiolite, and to north, you've got the Dalradian. So south to north, in a cross fault transect, you've got the ophiolite into the fault core and into the Dalradian. So I'm just going to now go through each of these units and talk to you a bit in detail about each unit, starting with this purple unit on the log being footwall damage zone 2. And then I'll try and explain to you how these observations have led to me trying to attempt to see how the Highland Boundary Fault evolved through time. So starting with that purple footwall damage zone 2 in the Highland border ophiolite, it is a carbonated serpentinite, and it displays a chaotic network of cross-cutting calcite veins. And this unit is cut by localized subhorizontal fractures with an alteration halo, which you can see in the picture. The fractures themselves have an anastomosing conjugate geometry and are comprised of curvy, cross-cutting brittle cracks. And orange-brown alteration halos extend about 3 centimetres either side of the fractures, and this alteration is symmetrical either side of the aperture. So damage zone, you can see clearly fault damage in this, but increasing towards the main slip plane of the fault, you've got this footwall damage zone 1 unit, which is a dolomitized serpentinite, which is properly termed as ophicarbonate, which forms from the alteration of serpentinite via a carbonate CO2-rich fluid. So I'd not go into too much detail about this unit, but it's characterized by these multi-phase carbonate veins that are about 2 to 10 centimeters thick, and it's got fine-grained dolomite in the middle, and then calcite lining the vein walls. This slide just shows a section of these multi-phase veins, but importantly, all that we really need to know for the purpose of this talk is that the veins have a dog-toothed epitaxial texture and are indicative of craxial growth and extensional opening mode fractures. So essentially, they show evidence of early reverse motion. And again, I won't go into the detail explaining these stereo nets, but the field evidence from these veins does show that there's 2 stages of early reverse motion on the Highland Boundary Fault. But importantly, these small scale strike slip faults that I saw mapped in the damage zone offset these, so it confirms the paleogeographic observations that you've got early reverse motion followed by a later sinistral strike slip. And order to constrain the isotopic composition and fluid sources from which the carbonate in the Highland border ophiolite grew, I did do some preliminary measurements of carbonate delta 13C and delta 18O, and the results are shown here. And you've got delta 13C ranging from 0.1 to 11.3 across all units. The ophicarbonate, which was a unit with the veins in it, typically has delta 13C values between 0.1 and -3, indicating of a marine signature, whereas the carbonated serpentinite, which was the unit that had all the cross-cutting fractures with the alteration, typically has delta 13C values between -5.5 and -8.5. So that's indicative of a magmatic signature. So these two different units formed differently, and it's quite similar to hydrothermal, typical lost city type environments. So one hypothesis for this damage zone in the Highland border ophiolite at Stonehaven is that it formed from hydrothermal alteration by seawater with the addition of magmatic CO2. And delta 18O values can be used to predict the temperature from which the carbonate precipitated. So using the stable isotope calculator, I then calculated the temperature for this mean delta 18O. So assuming the fluid precipitated from marine seawater, the temperature that the ophicarbonate formed was -100, where it crosses the zero here, and assuming for the purple carbonated serpentinite, assuming it's a magmatic, you're looking at a temperature, which a signature of -6, you're looking at a temperature of about 200, or -200, sorry. Therefore, you could hypothesize that the ophicarbonate formed from marine waters at 100 degrees, while the carbonated serpentinite formed from magmatic waters at 220 degrees. So this is just to bear in mind for when we're trying to pull everything, all the observations together into an evolution of the whole fault. But what is inside the fault cores leads to next. So after digging and moving all these large boulders, I found that the fault core consists of 4 distinct units that remain unmixed, which was quite surprising. So first you have a localized green gouge, then also a blue gouge of high plasticity, a red foliated chaotic breccia, and a red crackle breccia, which has large elongated wall rock lenses, of the Dalradium. So I'll just go through again each of these different fault core units. So we've got the thin sections were made for each of these units as well, which I'll show you the images as well to help explain the observations. So yeah, just that's important that there were 4 distinct units that remained unmixed despite such a large offset on this plate boundary fault. So the first unit is this localized green gouge, which is very thin, only about 30 centimeters, and is relatively homogeneous, free of any obvious clasts in the field. XRD observations revealed that almost half of it is clay, illite, smectite, and chlorite, and it's quartz rich. And it's only observed at one locality, so it could either represent a zone of localized alteration or a remnant fragment of a reworked, previously extensive fault core lithology. My thin sections observations reveal that the green gouge consists of small rounded clasts embedded in a fine-grained clay matrix. I did some analysis of all the class sizes and shapes, etc., which are the numbers here, but I'm not going to go into detail about how they were derived. All we need to really remember is that they're small, very small, rounded clasts. Next unit was this blue gouge, which is of high plasticity, and it was exactly like modelling clay, and one of our team even managed to model a fish in the field out of it. It was internally foliated, and the foliations were subparallel to the main plane of the Highland Boundary Fault, and in the field it contained small bleached white clasts, and occasionally the clast was a bit larger, as you can see on the log to the left. I did some permeability measurements on it, so it's very impermeable, and like the green gouge, it consists of almost 50% clay with the same chlorite, illite and smectite clays being present, and again it's quartz rich. So these are the thin sections of the blue gouge, and showing my interpretation of the section. So some clasts and matrix have a preferred orientation, although the foliation tends to deflect and wrap around the clasts. For instance, in this image to the left, the clast and fabric are aligned parallel, either parallel 15 degrees anti-clockwise or 10 degrees clockwise from the main slip surface of the fault. So they are consistent with Rideau shear geometries, confirming a strike slip origin. And again, in the image to the left, the fabric is aligned at high angles, about 60 to 75 degrees anti-clockwise in Rideau shear geometries. And you've got strain shadows, evident of high strain. So yeah, basically take home is that they're aligned in Rideau shear geometries and evidence of shear in this sinistral strike slip motion that we saw in the map. This slide shows some more close-up thin section images from this blue gouge. And typically the clasts are sub-rounded to rounded, and you can see some clasts have rounded edges suggestive of mechanical wear, whereas others have tapered elongate geometries with pressure solution seams along the edges, suggesting that there's been a combination of both shearing and chemical alteration. Again, you can see the strain shadows in the wings on some clasts, suggestive of local shearing. And like the green gouge, I've presented my numbers for the analysis of the class, but all we need to know is that they're larger and less circular than the green gouge, which is closer to the main slip surface. And this is where a lot of you will be interested, I guess, that surprisingly there was marine microfossils found within this blue gouge, included relatively intact fragments of ancient bryozoans, possibly of the Phenostella order, brachiopods and an echinoid spine. Importantly, these confirm that it's not just modern day clay deposited on the beach, and they have important implications for the mechanics and timing of the genesis of this gouge. And the presence of them suggests that strain is highly localized despite this 30 to 150 kilometers offset. Unfortunately, many of you will be disappointed to hear that I haven't done any more work on these fossils, partly because I didn't know how to extract them or what to do. So their presence remains a mystery somewhat. So coming away from the fault, you've got so you had the green gouge, the blue gouge, and coming away you get this red foliated chaotic breccia. But this image here just shows the contact between the blue gouge and the red foliated chaotic breccia in the field. And again, all this image is really showing is that you've got these localized red pods, so your red clay is mixing with your blue clay at the contact, and everything is aligned in these needle shear geometries. So into the red chaotic breccia. It consists of sub-rounded to rounded, circular to elongate clasts embedded within this dark brown to red fine-grained matrix, and red hematitic foliations define a clear structural fabric within this unit. And the fabrics themselves, shown in this serial, are typically aligned. Everything is aligned within these needle shear geometries. And you've got, but the foliation can wrap around clasts of the Dalradian wall rock. So these are just the thin section images from the red foliated chaotic breccia, and again you can see that they've clearly got a preferred alignment, and again everything is aligned within these needle shear geometries. But unlike the blue gouge, the clasts don't display tails or strain shadows, suggesting that strain is very localized within this blue gouge. But you do have pressure solution seams and evidence of dissolution and precipitation. So again, I've presented the numbers from my analysis, but all we need to know is that we're moving further away from the main slip plane of the fault, and these clasts, wall rock clasts, are becoming larger and more angular as you move away from the fault. And the last of the fault core units is this red crackle breccia, which has large elongate lenses of Dalradian wall rock up to 2.3 meters in length. Though again, the long axes of the clasts are aligned parallel to the Highland Boundary Fault, and thin high strain zones of clay are found between these between the lenses, as you can see in the field photograph. Unfortunately, this unit was too difficult to sample, so I don't have any thin section images from this unit. But just to repeat what I've said, our data suggests that the clasts become smaller as you get closer towards the fault. So you've got equidimensional aspect ratio of 1 class within the green gouge, and they become more lenticular in shape as you move towards the red foliated chaotic breccia. So this suggests that all the clasts are from the Dalradian, and it suggests that they've been plucked from the Dalradian wall rock, and the corners are preferentially attacked until the lozenge shape becomes a more equant grain in a self-similar pattern through rolling, fracturing, and or abrasion. This slide just highlights our XRD mineralogy from the fault core. And it shows that it's quite complex, but there's a distinct chemical change between the blue gouge and the red foliated chaotic breccia. So the blue gouge is comprised of magnesium illite smectite and iron and magnesium rich chlorite, whereas the red foliated chaotic breccia is composed of potassium illite, smectite and kaolinite, so there's no chlorite here. So it's assumed that the blue gouge and the green gouge are derived from the Highland Boundary ophiolite wall rocks, whereas the red foliated chaotic breccia are derived from the Dalradian wall rocks. And regardless of which lithology, which unit we're in, 50% of the illite is of the 1MD polytype, suggesting that it is fault derived. So again, it's just evidence that, if you need any more evidence that it is fault related, fault derived clay. So I've already said that the green gouge is already only found at one locality. So not every unit is present along the fault, and every unit is variable in terms of its thickness. So this shows a map of the 5 different structural logs I did at different locations, just to show that the internal structure is variable. It ranges, the fault core itself ranges from 3 meters here to 10.7 meters over this long strike section of 560 meters. So over a relatively short section, the fault core itself is variable. So just to summarise so far, I've started with the question, what's inside a plate boundary fault? And as I've just discussed, the answer is a structurally and lithologically variable fault core that ranges from 3 meters to 10.7 meters and is comprised of these 4 distinct units that all vary in thickness. The green gouge and blue gouge are derived from the Highland Boundary wall rocks, whereas the red foliated chaotic breccia are derived from the Dalradian wall rocks. But the question remains as to what was so striking was why these units remained unmixed. Why were they so distinct? Yet Dalradian clasts were found in every unit, implying some degree of mixing. So it took me a bit of time to get my head around how this fault core evolved. So I'm just going to present to you now this evolution of what I think, how these units have come to be as what we see today. So early in the fault, up in this first stage up here, you've got the Highland Boundary Fault juxtaposing the carbonated serpentinite and Dalradian wall rocks of distinct terrain. But we know just even by looking at serpentinite that it's mechanically it's very, very weak. So the fault is going to make use of this weak rock. So reverse faulting in this early stage of evolution resulted in the deformation of this mechanically weaker fault rock, and it, as I showed you the pictures, it's altered this carbonated serpentinite into the ophicarbonate through a CO2 rich fluid. The next stage, which is stage 2, we've into this sinistral strike slip regime, and the ophicarbonate is starting to form with Rideau shear geometries at different scales. And this was evidenced from the Rideau shears that have mapped in the field and all of the microstructural observations. And then next, you're coming into the mechanical processing of the Dalradian. So after you've altered carbonated serpentinite to ophicarbonate, which I'm trying to show in this little insert, the mechanical strength contrast between the wall rocks has changed. So before, your serpentinite was weaker than Dalradian, but now it's been altered into this stronger ophicarbonate, your Dalradian is going to be weaker. So the fault's therefore going to deform this weaker Dalradian wall rock. So I think at this point, the Dalradian started to the fault deformed the Dalradian wall rocks and plucked off large sections. So yeah, basically the red foliated chaotic breccia starts to form at this stage through the mechanical processing of the Dalradian. Next, you've got all these clasts, which I showed you in thin section, and it's becoming smoother and more equant as you get towards the main slip surface of the fault. So you've got rolling, fracturing, and/or abrasion, and this process of the classed evolution in a fault core is not unique to the Highland Boundary Fault. It's been described in the literature for many other faults. So this is not unique. However, after you've formed this red foliated chaotic breccia, next you then get the chemical processing of the Highland Boundary Fault to form this blue and green gouge. And I propose this occurs at 3 different stages, like to what's been published and described for the San Andreas fault. So first you get some fluids coming in along these already formed Riedel shears, and it starts to form the clay along these. The Ophi carbonate breaks down into this blue gouge along the fractures. So that's therefore why you get the fabric in your class all aligned within these Riedel shear geometries. And then you've got the last stage in the model is the contact, where I showed you the field photograph of the contact between the blue gouge and the red foliated chaotic breccia, where your red clay was therefore incorporated into the blue gouge. So when the fault became locked, or there was a reason for widening it, the fault plucked out bits of this Dalradian, forming rip-out class. But again, they're all aligned within these Riedel shear geometries, so it fits within this regime. So here I've just presented a scenario of explaining why this fault core of this large offset plate boundary fault consists of these distinct units. The red foliated chaotic breccia formed first by the mechanical processing of the Dalradian, and then your blue gouge formed later due to the chemical alteration of these Highland Boundary Fault wall locks along shear fractures. And this multi-event evolution caused the mechanical properties of the Highland Boundary Fault core to vary through time, becoming either stronger or weaker, which in turn will have affected the fault's ability to host earthquakes through time. The last question, just to, I guess, bring it all together with everything else that's been done in the literature, was then, well, how similar, fair enough that this exists, but how similar is this internal structure to other plate boundary faults that have been observed elsewhere? So if you can remember back to the very beginning of the talk, how I said that faults get wider on average as they increase, with increasing total displacement. This increase in width is thought to occur through fault growth, so as the faults link together, they become wider. However, the vast majority of these faults and these data sets are from intraplate faults, and plate boundary faults have been excluded. So in order to determine how similar the Highland Boundary Fault is to other plate boundary faults, I compiled all the data on the thicknesses of the fault cores and unified the way in which they were defined. And like previous compilations, so this is my data here from all these faults from intraplate faults. So like previously published, intraplate faults get wider as displacement increases, but plate boundary faults have very large displacement, so therefore should be plotted up here. And you'd expect them to have very wide fault cores, but from my observations on the Highland Boundary Fault, in some places the fault core was only 3 kilometres wide. So I gathered all the information I could on the thicknesses of these fault cores, and showed that plate boundary faults are actually anomalously narrow compared to intraplate faults, and they don't show this same trend of increasing thickness with increasing displacement. Instead, the Highland Boundary Fault being included, which are these turquoise squares plotted here, they're all narrow between 0.07 and 35 metres wide. In order to test whether this was related to their structure, constructed schematic structural logs, like what I did in the field for Stonehaven to capture the variability, and then showed that in places the Highland Boundary Fault is similar to other plate boundary faults. For example, comparable to the San Andreas Fault, to these ones here, the Highland Boundary Fault is the San Andreas Fault is composed of an internally foliated, highly sheared gouge with centimetre class wall rock lenses that are elongate parallel to the foliation, so very similar to what we observe for the Highland Boundary Fault. But in comparison to all the data put together, the fact that they're narrow doesn't appear to be related to the structure, because everything varies, the host rock, the slip direction, the plate boundary type, but in all instances, the plate boundaries remain comparatively narrow. So we can only really say that the Highland Boundary Fault is comparable to other plate boundary faults in terms of fault core thickness. But this in itself does have implications for how earthquakes behave. For the purpose of time, I won't go into much detail about the details of this and how I made the figure. But basically, I compiled and compared the data between seismic moment, which is essentially a measure of the earthquake magnitude, and average displacement for both plate boundary and intraplate fault events. And the data shows that for a given value of average displacement, so if you just go up the fault, you can see that plate boundary faults typically have a greater seismic moment and hence a larger earthquake magnitude than intraplate events. And this equation down here, so during an earthquake, your energy is partly consumed by the fault through fracturing and frictional, which is energy, which is shown as Eg and Ef. And the rest of the energy is released as seismic waves. So therefore, it's inferred that all plate boundary faults, these narrow, including the Highland Boundary Fault, are all narrow because they don't process intact rock as much during seismic events as intraplate faults. Therefore, plate boundary faults consume less energy than intraplate faults during earthquake, meaning that for a given value of average displacement, more energy is radiated to the surface. So plate boundary faults don't consume as much energy here, therefore they can radiate more energy as seismic waves. Whereas for intraplate faults, as they get wider, they generate more complex fault geometry. Therefore, more energy has to be consumed here, and less energy can therefore be released to the surface. So in summary, Highland Boundary Fault included, all plate boundary faults have narrow fault cores, and for this reason, they don't consume as much energy as intraplate faults during earthquakes. So I know that was quite a lot of information. So just to summarise, the Highland Boundary Fault consists of 4 structural and mineralogical distinct fault core units that remain unmixed. And these units all vary in thickness along strike, but they remain distinct due to differences in how the wall rocks have been processed through time. So the red foliated chaotic breccia formed first by this mechanical processing of the Dalradian, and the blue gouge formed later by the chemical alteration of the Highland border ophiolite. And our Highland Boundary Fault core thickness is comparable to other plate boundary faults, in the case that all plate boundary faults have a narrow fault core and they don't increase in width with increasing displacement, which in turn has implications for the earthquake energy balance and understanding how earthquake behaves at plate boundary faults. So this is just a list of references. So thank you for listening. Are there any questions?
I think we're having problems hearing you, Tom. You've been taking the helium. But how about I start with a question? We'll see if Tom can sort his microphone out. Lucy, if you went to other sections of the Highland Boundary Fault, like where there's not the Highland Border Complex, do you think you'd get the same sort of story? How much is it to do with the Highland Border Complex being there?
I think it is quite a lot to do with it being there, to be honest. I think you could possibly see the blue gouge. If you didn't have the Highland Border Complex, then you wouldn't see the blue gouge. But you may see the red foliated chaotic breccia if the Dalradian's been processed. If that makes sense.
Yeah, makes sense. Tom, are you okay? David, you've got your hand up. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask a question? And feel free, anyone else who wants to ask a question, feel free to unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Angus. It's great talk, Lucy. I mean, this is fantastic stuff, really detailed work and absolutely fascinating. But I've got what I think is rather a fundamental question, which is I'm curious to know why you're describing the Highland Boundary Fault as a plate boundary fault. Now, okay, I'm a bit out of date, but certainly 10 years ago, it wasn't a plate boundary fault. Gravity and magnetic data and very few. Am I going funny as well?
No, you're okay.
Okay, yeah, and very few inclusions from vents and things like that suggested that the basement was the same in the southeastern part of the Grampian Highlands as it is underneath the Midland Valley. So it's not really a plate boundary fault, it's much more of an intraplate fault, surely. The main plate boundary was to the south towards Iapetus.
I think from basically it was Tanner's work, wasn't it, in like the late 2000s, that because it used to be referred to as the Highland Border Complex, and there was a recent like a reappraisal of these rocks. They considered it to be an ophiolite that formed in a similar way to other what do you call it? Sorry, there are analogous ophiolites found in Italy at similar plate boundary settings.
Yes, I can see that. I mean, the ophiolitic rocks, have obviously been squidged up there from somewhere, but at deeper levels, that doesn't. The last I was aware, there wasn't any change in the basement. But maybe there's been more recent work since then. Maybe somebody else knows something about that. I don't know.
I muted a couple of people because there's a bit of background noise, but I don't know if Wilf, did you want to ask a question, or Graham?
Carry on. Ahead. I'll come in a minute.
Great. Okay. Well, I'm not sure if there was anyone else.
Okay, shall I go then?
Great. Yeah.
Yeah, kind of coming on a little bit from what David was asking. Faults that we might think of as Caledonian faults, Lucy, and I would say fantastic detail, and I love what you've been able to dig out of those beach exposures. I think it's absolutely fascinating. But one of the surprises I think that hides in a lot of these Caledonian so-called faults is the actual age of the movement.
Yeah.
So my question was going to be, have you tried to date any of these orthogenic clays, particularly in the blue and green gouges?
No, but I did want to, however, it was the plan, and
Right.
I have the clay fractionations to be able to do everything on, but I haven't, with COVID, I never really got round to.
I would strongly recommend that you pursue that.
Yeah, however, I think they must be much younger than Caledonian.
Well, that was what I was going to suggest to you. I'll offer you a small wager at the moment. These green and blue gouges particularly, and the red foliated gouge, are strikingly similar to the gouges that we dug out of the Schronlarig fault on the dam at Glendoe. Now, we were able to date some of the orthogenic clays, some of the new clays growing in the fault zone there. And those clays grew at the very end of the Carboniferous.
Okay.
And another population, a subpopulation, grew in the Jurassic. Now, that's a stick-on Caledonian fault. But the gouge, the blue and green gouge that's right in the very center of that gouge, that fault, is a Carboniferous gouge, or latest Carboniferous. So I think I would encourage you very strongly, if you can, to find a way of getting some of those separates dated, because I think you will find some really fascinating numbers coming out of that. And it would put a timeline on the various textures and shear fabrics that you've seen, because kind of coming back to David's point a little bit, I would encourage you also to really think carefully about what this Highland Boundary Fault zone has been, because it's been a big thing in the Ordovician. It's been a big thing at the end of the Ordovician into the Silurian, when the Highland border downbend was happening, and it's been rattling around in the Carboniferous, and particularly at the end of the Carboniferous. And so I think you made a comment at the beginning that it's probably been responsive to North Sea activity as well. I wouldn't be surprised if you could dig those numbers out of some of your clay separates as well. So I think there's a whole other PhD that you could get involved in looking at those clay separates and putting a timeline into those data. I'm fascinated by the fossils, because isn't Fenestrella or Fenestella, whatever you call it, isn't it
Ordovician
to Triassic, but kind of most distinctive of the
Carboniferous, I think.
Yes, so there's my little prediction. That blue gouge is actually Carboniferous.
Yeah.
So I think you've done some fascinating work, and I strongly encourage you to go and dig into it a little bit more. It's quite tricky to date those clays.
Yeah.
I'll send you some stuff we did with Stonehaven fault, and I'll send you some contacts, people like Simon Kemp in BGS, who might be.
That'd be good. Yeah, that'd be good. Thank you.
Fantastic.
I'm going to try and take over again from Angus. Have I still got my helium?
I know you're doing now. You're doing fine now.
Okay, fantastic. I understand that David Webster had a question to ask. So
good evening. Yeah, Lucy, lovely work. Just to follow up from Graham's talk about the timing, I've seen a lot of this stuff that John Parnell's done on dating some of these carbonates and hematites and dolomitization in these fault zones. Again, it's late Carboniferous into the Triassic. So some of the Graham talked about the clays, but I think some of the carbonates can be looked at. And if you look at John Parnell's work in Aberdeen.
Actually, yeah, I think so. How I was saying about how the carbonated serpentinite turns into the ophicarbonate through the CO2 rich fluid, Paleomag results dates that to like Carboniferous to 60 million years ago.
Yeah, that's what it's. John Parnell's stuff on the Paleomag has certainly shown that to be late carb. I think the dolomitization of the Carboniferous and the hematite might be Triassic. So, yeah, we've definitely got some Mesozoic, late Paleozoic, Mesozoic movement on that fault, I'm sure.
Yeah. The clays have to be younger than the Highland Boreophyllite dolomitization.
Great work, though. Thank you.
Yeah, excellent.
Thank you.
Does anybody else have anything to contribute? If you do, just unmute yourself and ask away. No? May I ask a question then?
Yeah, I had a question. Sorry,
good.
Tom.
Go for
Yeah,
it.
great talk, Lucy. I just wondered whether there had been any observations of the gouge at other points along the Highland border fault.
Not that I'm aware of, and I only did Stonehaven.
Right.
That would, again, I'd like to. I did go to the Balmaha section, but I don't think it's going to be as easy to do what we did here. What we did at Stonehaven at that section, but it would be worthwhile having a dig around or somewhere on the Isle of Bute as well. I haven't done it myself, but
or maybe in Ellen.
Pardon? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I did go there as well, but it's not so easy to see where the actual fault is, the main slip surface. Whereas in Stonehaven, you can clearly see it going through the bay. Whereas at all these other locations, it's very difficult to actually say where the fault is. So that was my reasoning for just focusing on Stonehaven.
Thank you. Anybody else out there?
Hello?
I think Wilf's got a question.
Julian as well.
Yep.
Julian first and then Wilf.
Hello, yes. Could I ask you how you make a thin section of a blue clay? I've only sort of had experience of harder rocks.
I didn't do it myself. I sent it away to a specialist lab, so I can't exactly answer that.
Okay.
Sorry.
It involves a lot of impregnation and often vacuum impregnation in a resin of some sort, and then treat it like a normal thin section once you've hardened it. Certainly that's what we did for the Stonehaven fault material. It takes a very, very long time.
presumably you have to freeze dry it to get the water out, and then you impregnate it with your epoxy or something.
You can't freeze dry it because I think that affects the way the layers of the clay bonds.
Oh, right.
But used oven dry it, doesn't affect it so much.
Yeah, I think we kept ours refrigerated but not frozen, and then withdrew any moisture initially under vacuum and drew the resin in at the same time. So you get a lot of nice blue colors in our thin sections. It's quite as Lucy said, it's a very expert technique and quite tricky to achieve.
I can imagine that. Thank you.
I was just wondering whether you considered whether the composition and microstructure and the thickness of each gouge zone relates to the mechanical properties of rocks on either side of the fault at the time that it's moving. Because, you know, the movements are so long, or so large, you're going to get very different rock types adjacent to each other on the fault zone as that movement develops over time.
Yeah.
How important are the properties of dalradian, for example, against the other side of the fault? I mean, in terms of contrasting strength, contrasting fracture.
I haven't looked, so I guess I never really looked at the wall rocks, I guess, in much detail. But I guess the only way I can really answer your question is that it does matter. The strength contrast between like the different wall rocks matters. So as I said in the talk, the evolution, when I was trying to just work out when and how each formed, because the dalradian was stronger than or weaker than the Highland boreophyllite, therefore you're going to like make use of the weaker rock. So therefore it is in a way related to the mechanical properties of the wall rocks.
Yeah. So you don't think the gouges will be translated as the fault translates?
I'm unsure.
You know what I mean? I mean, you might have totally different rock types against each other forming one gouge.
Yeah.
And then that gouge is smeared along.
Yeah.
Into the next phase of movement.
Yeah, no, that is a possibility, but I haven't explored it. But it could be. But I think, I'm unsure.
It's okay to be unsure. If there aren't any other questions,
I have a question.
Let Jonathan go first.
Yeah, thank you. Lucy, thank you very much for the presentation.
You're welcome.
In your studies, did you see any evidence of any kind of mineralization, given the fact that you've been mentioning, hydrothermal alteration at about 100 degrees and some kind of magmatic alteration at around 200 degrees? Was there any evidence of mineralization along there, in what you saw?
So that was not in the fault core units, but I have got thin sections of the carbonates in the damage zone, but haven't looked at them in any detail, to be honest. I'm mainly focused on the fault core units. So that hydrothermal alteration in the damage zones, I haven't looked at it.
Okay, thank you.
Peter, may I ask a question? Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, can.
I didn't really understand what you said about energy associating with the fault movement and earthquakes at the surface, but essentially a related question. Once you have a fault and it moves and you generate some clay, you generate a plane of weakness. Does that mean that the more the fault moves, the more easily it moves? And essentially you need lower energy to move it and a positive feedback system which keeps the core of the fault thin, because that is the point of easiest translation.
Exactly, yes. Yes.
Oh.
Graham, you have your hand up there.
If I may, if nobody else has a question. And this is just to return to the fossils, Lucy. Do you think it's possible, given that we've got fossil material introduced into a fault gouge, and those fossil fragments that you showed us look really quite well preserved, despite being in a fault gouge? So at the time that that gouge was forming, or at least incorporating those fossil fragments, was the Highland Boundary Fault an open fissure to the surface? How did these get in there?
Possibly.
Filtration down.
I don't understand the fossils, to be honest.
I think that's a fascinating possibility as well. There's another thing to think about.
Yeah.
As a paleontologist, I can also say that most paleontologists don't really understand the fossils either. So, no, I was wondering though, so places like the Dunans limestone, the fossils from there have been silicified. And I can't remember from your slide whether or not those bits and pieces you had in there were still calcareous carbonate, or whether or not they'd been altered.
They have been slightly altered, yes.
So in which case they could be potentially a little bit more robust. And if they've been dragged in from one of the other bits of limestone along the Highland Boundary Fault, then that also could account for them still being there.
Yeah.
To have further out on Graham's question, his point that he was making earlier on. But yeah, I wouldn't, don't give yourself a hard time about the fossils. Right, in that case, it's just after 8 o'clock. I think I will wrap this up with a vote of thanks to Lucy, who has presented for what's been for me the most in-depth account of looking inside a fault. I think the only other I've looked at in such great depth is the Carbonaris fault zone in southern Spain, but that's not a plate boundary fault, if I remember correctly. So it was simply fascinating looking at these things in such detail, and I love the way that what you've done there actually sort of accounts for all, you've made this comparison and shown that there's similar processes occurring in all other plate boundary faults, essentially throughout the world. So that's really, really got a lot of impact for it. So, well done there. That's great. Another thing is I felt a bit sorry for you, actually, particularly with the questions, because all of a sudden everybody was saying, oh, you could do this, you could do that. I was thinking, Paul has just started a full-time job. How is she going to be able to do all of this stuff? I really do hope you are able to continue the research and do this kind of thing on the side, because it looks like you've got off to a fantastic start there. And I mean, can you tell us, have you got any hopes to be able to continue dating or things like that? Dating the
I would love to date it, but yeah, time.
Yeah, and as Jen points out, she points out that the best type of PhD are the ones that open up further questions for research. So hopefully maybe you've set a ball rolling there for future students to work on, which is great. Yeah, as Stephanie also points out, what you have proved is that the more you know that you don't know. That's what's so fascinating and brilliant about a lot of these presentations, a lot of the lectures that people give to the society, is that it stimulates people's minds and gets their minds thinking about other things that could be done and questions like that. And I think your presentation has certainly done that this evening. So thank you all for showing us inside a fault and stimulating our minds this evening. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Virtual clap.